is South Asia Matters, a brand new podcast on the brand new website called Avaz South Asia. And I'm today with Swarnim Wagle in Colombo. There is the Indian Ocean lapping on the shores just in front of my room. I'll show it to you in a second. But Swarnim is, of course, a very well-known economist and a politician of the Rastriya Swatantra Party in Nepal. We are on the Taj Samudra, which evidently is owned by a Nepali businessman.
I'm told, yeah.
And of course, the Taj is an iconic Indian hotel chain, but if it's owned by a Nepali businessman, then we're already in one South Asia. But Swarnim, welcome so much to Avaz South Asia.
Pleasure to be with you.
This is a brand new website, a web platform. And I'm going to ask you, as a Nepali economist, politician, first of all, congratulations on your election. But what is for you as a Nepali, what does it mean to be South Asian? Are you South Asian?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Nepal is slightly different from the rest of South Asia in the sense that we were never colonized. However, there was this engagement way back from the British days. 1816, there was an Anglo-Nepal war, after which, the regime of the day opted for a policy of coexistence and all that. Then after Indian independence and the British left the subcontinent, there's been a shift. But we share the same ecology, similar languages, similar religious and cultural heritage. So we are part of South Asia.
You've talked a lot about the demography of Nepal, how your very small population is a very young one. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, small only relative to India and China.
Well, absolutely.
If we were in the European Union, we would be the 7th largest country in the European Union.
Good Lord.
So it's 30 million. But you're absolutely right. Half the country is under the age of 25. Just think about that, right? Half the country. But the world is fast aging. India, I think the median age is around 29, 30. China is 38. Japan is in the late 40s.
China is 38?
Yeah, it's already aged. So what that implies is for countries that are still very poor and are trying to catch up fast in terms of per capita income, the demographic window is very small, right? So this is why the urgency of political, economic reforms and get the governance going to make that rapidly. As some countries in East Asia have shown that it can be done within a generation or two. The West obviously took about 2 centuries, right? They started this modern economic growth process after the Industrial Revolution. But countries that have really caught up have done it by marrying it with this demographic influx. And that has to be in tandem with the economic reforms. And some of the economic dynamism that we saw in India, for example, also, reforms, that demographic burst, that hunger for catch up, when it all comes together, then you tend to make that leap.
You think that's happening in Nepal? Because, you're now part of the Rastriya Swatantra Party. You broke away from the Nepali Congress, which is one of Nepal's oldest political parties. And let me tell you, I'm all in favor of traditional political parties. I mean, the RSP is doing really well. You guys did really well in the elections last year and as well as in the by-elections this year. So how do you sort of cohere the politics
story.
with the economics?
Demographic story, it's the diaspora story.
Diaspora story.
Diaspora, absolutely. So folks have had to leave the country in big numbers.
Looking for work abroad.
Looking for work abroad because economically we've stagnated, right? Nepal has made amazing social and political advances. We're very proud of our socio-political advances, but economically we're a laggard. We're an absolute laggard. Other than Afghanistan, we're the poorest country in the entire continent of Asia, not just South Asia. And so what that meant is economically we're really, really behind. And think of that demographic burst, 500,000 coming into the workforce every year. Where are the jobs? Very few. Hence, the push factor as well as the demand on the other side. The Gulf countries, Malaysia, Korea, looking for low-paying, semi-skilled, highly disciplined workforce have tapped to the Nepali market. And we've supplied that, right? The demographic window comes in. Ideally, we would have generated economic opportunities within Nepal,
right?
So that many of these folks would have stayed in the country and developed Nepal.
So where is the diaspora going? Is it going to the Gulf? Is it going to Europe?
The temporary migrants all to the Gulf, and they've tended to come back, after a few years. The permanent migrants, which is now increasing in numbers, United States, Europe, Australia, huge numbers. And partly East Asia, but East Asia is still quite hostile to permanent Asia.
So these temporary migrants, for example, in the Gulf, they're competing with other migrants from India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. So how does that, how do you look at that?
Well, there seems to be, and the demand seems to be almost unlimited in the sense that there appears to be, I don't know if somebody has done a proper study on this, but there's a division of labor there, right? The Filipinos, for example,
are on top of the heap.
Kerala folks are doing tend to specialize in some aspects of the professions. Bangladeshis, and then Nepalis, you see them a lot in Qatar airport, for example.
Well, they built the football stadium.
A lot of the we tend to be on the semi to unskilled segments, I think.
Now, can you cohere with me this boom, this migration boom, plus the social political changes that are taking place inside Nepal?
Yeah, so folks, even if they were not terribly sophisticated in their educational upbringing, etc., they've seen the world now, right? Even folks who've remained behind in Nepal are hyper connected to what's going on in the US, in India, in China, everywhere. So that progress that they've seen elsewhere, they ask, why not here? Why are we so far behind? And look at this corrupt lot that is really
Which corrupt lot?
misgoverned. The old guard,
Who are they?
the political guard. The ones who are running the country for the last 30 years. So they've begun to ask that question. And these young folks may not even be sentimentally attached to a lot of the democratic struggles that the current guard actually started their career with, for which folks like us give them due credit. Our argument is they've stayed, past the, what do you say, welcome date or whatever. They've overextended their welcome. And now it's terrible misgovernance, and which is resulting in this economic stagnation, these corruption scandals almost every day, and this culture of impunity. Nobody goes to prison because all the political institutions have been captured. Constitutional bodies, that separation of power is no longer there. So that frustration is now, because information is so readily available, and you see how other countries that have leapt ahead have done it. Right? Even India, over the last 20 years, amazing progress.
No, we've got the Aam Aadmi Party, but that's increasingly becoming like a traditional political party, right? Where the focus is around one or two leaders. So how is the RSP, the Rastriya Swatantra Party, your
we don't
party?
compare
How are you
ourselves with
different?
Aam Aadmi. It's
Yeah.
two different parties. I mean,
Absolutely.
Aam Aadmi, much larger theater in India. Delhi
Delhi.
alone is 30 million, right?
And now Punjab.
And now Punjab. Ours is already a national party in the sense that we are nationally defined. We got what is it, 9 to 10% of the votes in the first round, 21 seats in the House of Parliament. So already a national party with all country presence, and we're hoping that this hunger for change, frustration with the old guard, will really push us, give us the opportunity to reform, make these reforms that we want.
So Rabi Lamichhane, your leader, was forced to exit the party because he evidently has an American passport, and either he didn't realize it or he didn't apply for Nepali
He's
citizenship.
very much the president of our party.
Okay.
He hasn't exited the party. He exited the government after
The government.
days.
That's right. He was
On a
deputy prime
technicality.
minister.
He was deputy prime minister. On a technicality, there was some issue. He had already given up his American citizenship and passport, but he hadn't provided the
Nepali documents.
The notification to a concerned authority.
I see.
So it was a technicality which he remedied, and then he fought the election again, won with even larger margin the next round, and then he's very much an MP now.
Very charismatic former journalist and former sort of a singer, right?
Yeah, with a pulse for what the needs of the people are, and at times when the state has been absent, recently there's a crisis in Israel, for example. So even as a media person, he had 1 feet in the humanitarian domain. Right?
In what way?
So when Nepali states institutions didn't function, so he was rescuing people, for example, from the Gulf, people in trouble, they would turn to him
During this crisis?
For the last 10 years. Right? So he has a huge following among the migrant workers, for example, the diaspora, who've lost faith in the formal institutions of the Nepali state, and they've turned to non-governmental organizations or charismatic individuals with some influence, like Rabi Lamichhane ji. So I think that gave him that base, and he realized, if I can do so much good through the media, why not make the ultimate plunge into politics where I would be able to do much more? And I think that was his motivation of coming into politics.
So somebody like you, Swarnim, you're an economist. You also made the plunge into politics. So at the end of the day, it's politics that drives change. But you are spurning politics, right? So, this contradiction, explain this to me.
No, it can be a very noble profession, right?
Absolutely.
Even in Nepal,
Even in Nepal, you can't say that.
No,
Listen, it's
what
the
I-
old guard that gave
even
you
in
your
Nepal-
constitution,
no.
that did away with the monarchy.
No, I've appreciated that. I just did, right?
But talk about it a little bit more.
Even in Nepal, my role model is a politician, BP Koirala. So I want to take the new generation Nepalis to follow the ideals and the dreams and the aspirations that somebody like BP Koirala embodied in the 50s and the 60s. Even at very low levels of income, you can be a plural, vibrant democracy and yet aspire for modernity, right? So
You can.
You can. And he showed that.
In the 50s.
He had a very brief tenure, 17 months before the king locked him up in prison without trial
King
for 8 years,
Mahendra.
King Mahendra. And then he had to go to exile in India for another 8 years, right? But he was a Renaissance man in Nepal, way ahead of his times. And some of the vision that he had 50, 60 years ago, we're trying to implement just now. So in that sense, even my dream idol person, BP Koirala, was a politician. Right? It just, and many, I don't want to go into names, but many of them started with that early idealism. But somehow along the way, they've lost that zeal, they've become corrupt, they've become inept. Now the whole quest is to hang on, partly to keep amassing sort of illicit wealth, but also to then protect themselves, and hence the capture of all the institutions and the weakening of our democratic sort of fabric.
So you remain an economist, but you also are a politician. So you're able to manage both?
I'm a trained economist. I studied at the LSE, Harvard, ANU. I met the president of Sri Lanka here, where I was actually presenting him a paper on the Sri Lankan economic crisis that I've co-authored with a professor from Australia, Premachandra Athukolala. But together with that, we discussed South Asian politics, Lumbini as a bond between Nepal and Sri Lanka, and the huge potentials of IT to bring in the younger demographic now into the economy.
The president is an unelected president because there was a crisis in Sri Lanka just over a year ago, and they still haven't had elections. They're probably slated for next year.
But he seems to be turning the economy around. And last year, when I was in Sri Lanka, many people thought the only person who could possibly rescue Sri Lanka would be somebody with Ranil Wickremesinghe's experience. And he's a fighter. In 1977, the first reform-oriented government of Sri Lanka under the UNP, United National Party, the first reforming nation in South Asia. He was already a cabinet minister then, 77. So that seasoned sort of...
Well, he's had 50 years in politics, so he's obviously the smartest and
when I met him last year,
craftiest politician.
He was a party of one member.
That's right.
And so it takes some skill and credentials to be trusted by so many to take an entire country out of this morass.
Absolutely. But let me come back to you on Nepal and a couple of questions. In our part of the world, especially in India, caste plays such a big role, right? In your country, you have the caste politics, you have class issues, the rich and the poor. You also have the division between the Terai and the Pahar. Explain that to me. In the by-election right now, in which you one of the 3 seats that you won, Upendra Yadav, who is a big leader of the Madhes, who had lost the previous parliamentary election, came back to win, and he's in coalition with the RSP. But explain this divide a little bit.
Jyoti, I think, caste plays a big role, but Nepal, as you know, is sort of mixture of both the Indo-Aryan races as well as the Mongoloid sort of ethnic stock.
Right.
I think in Nepal, it's the ethnic allegiance that plays a bigger role. So if you have a Magar candidate or a Gurung candidate or a Newar candidate, you might be tilted a little bit in favoring that candidate, irrespective of your ideological beliefs. However, we've gone through these ideological struggles for 70, 80 years. Whether you are a Nepali Congress or a communist or a non-communist, that ideological identity is also quite important. And in fact, for the last 30 years, that has been the primary source of sort of election victories. Caste, not so much, except in the Tarai, you tend to say, well, the Yadavs probably, you carry as a bloc. But even that was demolished this time. C.K. Raut is not from a Yadav community. He, like the RSP, which made inroads in the Kathmandu Valley, urban areas, and the Pahar, in Tarai, it was C.K. Raut, the story.
But he's a very separatist.
No, he's given up all that.
He's given up his secession from the Republic.
He's completely accepted the Constitution of Nepal, upholds the territorial integrity of the country, and he's given up his secessionist beliefs many years ago. And this is how people have rewarded him, handsomely. Now he's a rising force in the Tarai, and he defeated Upendra Yadav in the Mangsir elections, the November
parliamentary elections. Yeah.
So Upendra had to come back to a by-election.
That's right.
So even in Tarai, where caste allegiance is kind of mimicking UP, Bihar kind of politics, that's been weakened substantially, which is amazingly good news for Nepal.
But don't you think that at one point the Tarai was so much richer than the Pahar? Of course, that story has changed around a lot. And we talk about, in India at least, we continue to talk about the so-called India blockade of 2015, which the Nepalis say was inspired by India. Of course, the Indians deny that. But, down the line, 8 years down the line, how are things shaping up?
No, the contestation then was, you could have waited 8 years to draft this constitution. Why didn't you take the entire country along? There was some grievance in the Tarai, in the Madhes, among the Madhesi parties and the people, to make some clauses and provisions more inclusive and all that. The mainstream political party, it was passed by 90% of the MPs who were members of the Constituent Assembly. They said, well, there are provisions to amend the Constitution within. Let's not, if we wait any longer, this may never happen. There's so many designs against this. So that was the push. I myself wish we could have been more patient and taken everybody along. So the blockade, the agitation in Madhes, but all that is now, we've gone through 2 election cycles since.
You think it's settled?
It's whatever. It's never settled, right? It's a work in progress. But whatever we need to amend and improve, we'll do it through the constitutional process. There are provisions therein where you get the votes, you amend. Yeah? The richer Tarai bit. There are nuances. Right? There are 8 districts in Madhes, but there are, I think, 20 or 21 districts along the entire border. There are districts like Rautahat and Mahottari, where there's been a beautiful highway running through those districts for 50 years. You would associate physical development with progress and all that. Yet, in terms of Human Development Index, Social Progress Index, Multidimensional Poverty Index, these districts are behind. In fact, far behind than these remote Himalayan districts like Dolpa, for example. Right? So there is genuine merit to the grievances. On the other hand, there are the richest districts are also from the Tarai, Parsa and Morang, and some of the richest, right, after Kathmandu Valley and Kasti. Rupandehi, Bhairava is very rich, and it's the proximity to India, it's a trading, entrepot, and industrial bases and all that. So it's a varied story, and if you dig deeper why Parsa next door is rich and Rautahat is far behind, then the social issues also come into the picture. Maybe it's empowerment of women where we lag behind. Maybe the initial investments have been inadequate and all that. So it's a much more nuanced, very differentiated picture.
But you feel that the people of the Madhes, which had all these social, and not just economic grievances, although of course that played a very big role, a lot of social grievances as well, is that the Bahun Chetris of the Pahad, of the mountains, were refusing to share power.
It's not Bahun Chetris were in the last 20, 30 years.
The Kathmandu Valley, the people of the valley.
They came out of the sort of democratic struggle. So they've done a lot in empowering, fighting against the Shaha and the Rana, who were not Brahmin Chetri. They ruled Nepal for 200 years. Right? So it's a very, very nuanced picture. So for a person like B.P. Koirala, he appointed a Dalit general secretary in 1950s, way ahead of his times, right? And his cabinet, the first woman in cabinet, was 1959 in Nepal. Very inclusive, that his cabinet reflected the Nepali mosaic, even then, right? So it's been a pity that politicians after him have not followed in his footsteps. So on the issue of inclusion, there was a genuine grievance, and we're trying to rectify it peacefully through constitutional means, and Tarai is increasingly getting its fair share.
Does that mean that parties like yours, smaller parties like yours, will you work together with the ruling party, the Nepali Congress, plus the big opposition, UML? Are you willing to work together to resolve the problems of the
We're against them when it comes to issues of corruption and all that. We feel they're really corrupt and inept, right? And Nepali people are looking for a fresh entry of political forces who are aligned with this new demographic aspiration as well as angst about faster, rapid catch-up before climate change gets in the way, before our demographic clock sort of ends and all that. So we are for rapid catch-up and good governance. And if these other parties also improve suddenly, I don't know how they will, but maybe with a new generation from within their party coming up, we can align with them on an issue-by-issue basis. Right? But I don't see them as coalition partners. We're actually very afraid that we'll be tainted. Our party has been invited to join the government many times, so we've been very cautious in that regard. And the only condition under which we will join the government would be to get influential portfolios where we can show progress at a very short period, and people can see the results. Right? We're not going to go to power just for the sake of it, and that's how we differ. Right? We want to prepare, win a handsome mandate, possibly form a majority government, and unleash these reforms in a very short period to show results.
But good governance and banishing corruption or making it cleaner, if you like, that's hardly an ideology. I mean, we don't know. Nobody knows what you really stand for.
No, you haven't read our document.
I've read your document. I know a lot of your politicians.
Nobody. That's what I find. They haven't read our constitution. They haven't read the election manifesto. We are a social democratic party, a liberal social democratic party.
On the right, you believe in a free market.
Not at all. Not at all. We're very much at the center. So this is the sort of this is what our folks hostile to us would want to portray.
Okay.
We do want to be very friendly to the private sector. So this will be a departure.
Absolutely.
Because that wealth creation that would be necessary. But given the structural discrimination, the problems that we've gone through as a society, the state will continue to be very active and invest in a viable, something that we can afford, the welfare state. But where will that wealth come from? It has to come from the dynamic private sector wealth creation. So it will be a nice mix. It's a social market economy, if you like, modeled along the Nordic countries, but tailored to our conditions at much lower per capita incomes.
Well, you have a smaller population, so you can perhaps experiment with that.
And already we have the most generous welfare state in South Asia relative to the size of our economy. We spend 4% of our GDP on transfers, social protection. I know India is also doing a lot.
I thought Sri Lanka was compared to the size of
Sri Lanka
population.
invested in health and education, primary health, primary education,
Right.
way back. So it was known as a very progressive country. But as a share of the economy, relative to the size of our GDP, we spend a lot.
Okay. Talk to me a little bit about the India-Nepal relationship. I know you're running out of time, just a few minutes. The India-Nepal relationship has gone through lots of ups and downs. We know the ups. But the downs right now are around this map that the former Prime Minister, KP Oli, where parts of Indian territory, we all know that, Libya-Dhura and the whole Kalapani issue, a part of your map now. How do you resolve that?
It's a contested terrain, competing narratives are there, when do you go back to the British days, which map do you refer to, what exactly is the origin of the river Kali. So Nepal took a position based on some historical documents that Libya-Dhura and that
whole area.
Chutse Naksa, as we call it, that pointed map belongs to Nepal. India has not agreed. So let's settle it on the basis of documents, historical things. Has to be through negotiations, and let's not allow this to disrupt other aspects of this very rich, multifaceted dimensions. And India is doing that with China. You have a huge border dispute. You had a long-standing border dispute with Bangladesh, but that didn't keep the two countries from engaging constructively in other areas. So that particular dispute, let's settle it through negotiations, experts, historical record. Through the established mechanisms, foreign secretary to foreign secretary mechanisms. Let's get the map guys into the scene, and so there's a very healthy, very constructive way to resolve this, and not be too miffed about what a particular country chose to do at a particular time in history for whatever internal reasons.
Okay, so you think that it can be resolved if both put their minds in it?
We haven't even started the conversation.
That's right.
So Nepal took a position. There was unprecedented unanimity in Nepal's position.
Right.
India took a different view, and there's some discrepancy in how the pre-47, post-47 documents and records could be assessed and interpreted. And so let's sit and go through this. I think it can be resolved.
So you talked about the India-China relationship, particularly bitter right now because of Chinese troops amassed on the line of actual control. But it seems as if China, which is a good friend of Nepal's, and your Prime Minister, Mr. Prachand, has just returned from Beijing, and prior to that from India. But my question is about Chinese power plants or manufacturing power plants in Nepal. And the Indian government has said that India will not buy power from Nepal if it's manufactured by China.
So it's a bit of a bind for Nepal. A lot of these power projects. So Nepal has huge potential in hydropower.
That's right. 80,000 megawatts, how much is it?
At least 40,000 commercially viable, theoretically going up to 80, even 100,000 megawatts of clean energy, which can do wonders to displace dirty sources of fuel in India and even Bangladesh. And so in an era of climate change, it's a shared global sort of public good and all that. A lot of our projects are actually funded by private capital. The state is only 1/3 now, 2/3 is private capital. And many of these biddings involve international competitive bidding. So the Chinese, for their efficiency, the cloud, their experience, they've tended to win many of these contracts. And I know there's the whole state sort of subsidies, state facilitation bit. But nonetheless, they built these power plants. India, now geopolitics has come into the picture. So the US and India have taken an interest in how China is spreading its influence in what they regard as their
sphere of influence.
Area of influence. It's like a South Asian Monroe Doctrine, perhaps. But what we've said is, well, India is free to make its choices. It can say, I will buy from this. And for Nepal, unfortunately, India is a monopolist. It's possibly the only buyer we have, right? We can't. The really densely populated Chinese clusters are very far. It's economically not viable. But I think pragmatically, I haven't discussed this in detail, but Nepal also needs a lot of internal energy. So all our energy needs will have to be powered through hydrographic resources. So if there are segments of our production that cannot be exported, let's use them within. And things that can be sent to India, that India will buy. So I think, again, they're a pragmatic, constructive approach. And in recent years, India has actually become much more engaged in our power plants. There are, I think, 5 or 6 big projects that have been signed to produce almost 4,500 megawatts of energy. Now, why is that number important? For the last 100 years, we've only produced 3,000 megawatts so far, and yet there's 4,500 megawatts of energy being produced through Indian state-owned enterprises. The Satlas, for example, is doing Arun. There's Furkot Karnali and all that. And there are big ones like Karnali Chisapani that would even come into the Pancheshwar is still unresolved and all that. But there are 4 or 5 that have been during the COVID years and after. So that's actually a positive sign. And that energy is destined for India.
And the Nepali cabinet has just a few days ago given permission for Nepal to sell electricity to India.
That's another very positive development. So in that regard, yes, we will have access to the Bangladeshi market, for which there's a big demand for Nepali power. The Bangladeshis have often said, we want to invest in Sunkoshi, for example, 600, 700 megawatt power plant. But India is between Bangladesh and...
So is India coming in the way, or is it being less...
The perception was India was reluctant to facilitate this exchange, direct exchange between Nepal and Bangladesh. But I think India's recent posturing has been very positive in the sense that they've said, you can do that trade, but do it through our transmission lines. And we can even work towards a trilateral or even a quadrilateral grid in that part of South Asia. BBIN, for example. So Bhutan and India already trade, so there's a vibrant bilateral trade there. Nepal and India already trade, and Bangladesh and India already trade. But can we, quadrilateralize all these fairly successful bilateral relationships?
But could you do a regional energy market, for example?
I think we're headed in that direction, absolutely.
So that all the countries of South Asia, whether it's Afghanistan,
even Sri Lanka is now in the, the people are talking about these underground cables, so BBIN, BIMSTEC, there's a lot of action there.
But not on the Afghanistan-Pakistan side.
Not on this, yeah. So the rest of SAARC has been dormant since 2015.
So electricity or Bijli, the spark that lights up South Asia, do you think that could be a big game changer?
It is a game changer. We need all that sort of clean energy to power our economic growth cleanly in an era of climate change, when our Himalayan glaciers are melting, etc. When countries trade with each other, are economically dependent on each other, it's also less likely that they become hostile to each other, right? There's the McDonald's theory. I think we're headed in that direction where, so we're discussing one South Asian cooperation, regional solidarity, as well as meaningful progress and results on the ground. And electricity would be that tangible benefit. Even this India-Nepal difficulty in our relationships around 2015. During the earthquake, amazing goodwill because India came in fast. I was in the government at the time and I saw firsthand how that overwhelming support from the Indian government. Then that was followed by a blockade where many Nepalis blamed the Indians for it. So again, dipped. But what warmed the relationships after that? It was electricity trade. So Talkebar, Muzaffarpur transmission line that got completed. Nepal was used to go through 12, 14, 16 hours of power cuts every day. And suddenly through importing, not exporting Nepali electricity, but import of Indian electricity, voila, the thing was gone, blackout was gone. So that Nepalis grudgingly, I give credit to the power of trade. And now the narrative is kind of well settled that because of our geological imperative, we have to export our surplus electricity during the monsoon seasons, and we have to import electricity during the dry season. India doesn't have that compulsion. Right. So for us, trade is absolutely necessary. But India is a large market. You can even out its seasonality within. But for Nepal, we have to trade. And that realization, I think, is allowing us to cooperate much more meaningfully.
Swarnim Wagle, economist and now politician, thank you so much for speaking to South Asia.
Wonderful.